I grew up hearing from her that I was fat, that I was ugly, that I had a big nose, and that I could not sing. So I believed all of those lies about myself, that I was worthless, that I was ugly, that no one could love me, that no one would want me. Well, he became very abusive in every sense of the word. Spiritually abusive, physically abusive, emotionally, even sexually abusive. He actually raped me a few times. And he was in a rage, yelling, cussing, screaming, throwing things. But then it hit me. I looked down at my daughter, and she was sitting there playing in the midst of all this chaos, with all of the things being thrown, all of the yelling. She was sitting there playing and humming.
How long did you make it after that?
Almost 16 years.
16? Wow.
Yeah. Okay. I am called the queen of codependency. Let me tell you, I put up with way more than I ever should have. So every day I would pray, God, I know you're real, but I don't know anything else about what the truth is. So please show me your truth. Show me.
Psychology Today defines codependency as a dysfunctional relationship dynamic where one person sacrifices their own needs and well-being for the sake of another. Psych Central says the main sign of codependency is consistently elevating the needs of others above your own. Are you the peacekeeper in your family? Do you find yourself yielding to what others want you to do, even though you don't believe it's the right decision? Do you consider yourself a pushover? Do you consistently feel like you are a doormat? If so, you may be codependent. How does a person break the chains of codependency? How do I face the fear of rejection? Can God help me, or am I forever doomed to this codependent pattern of dysfunction? These are questions that I want to discuss with our guest today as she shares her life change story with us. Our guest is zooming in all the way from Oklahoma, and I can't wait for you to hear her story. I'm Eric Hutchinson, and this is the If Nothing Changes podcast. So, hey, friend, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. I'm Linda. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I struggle with codependency. Also, I struggle with grief from loss of both of my parents. And I absolutely love recovery and currently live in Oklahoma.
Well, Linda, thank you so much for agreeing to be on my podcast. I'm really excited to hear your story and for you to share it with others. Why don't we start with where you grew up? Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and a little about what it was like in your family.
So I grew up in California in the Bay Area. My parents were both strong believers. They were both in ministry. My dad owned a family business. So I grew up in, helping out in that business when I could. I do have an older sister. She had mental issues and was very verbally and sometimes physically abusive to me. I also had an older brother who passed away about 12 years ago. Life was overall pretty good. My parents were amazing. Everyone has issues. My dad, I discovered after I got into recovery, was codependent. So some of my behaviors, I think I learned from him, but I pretty much remember my first real codependent emotion was with my sister. It really stemmed with her because of the abuse and things that I dealt with her. I found myself changing who I was and the things I would say to try to placate her, to try to keep the peace. And I thought it was my job to make everybody happy. So that's pretty much where my codependency started. But other than that, my life overall was pretty good growing up.
So can you share, if it's okay for you to share about the mental health issues that your sister has? Was it bipolar? Was it schizophrenia? I mean, can you go into that a little bit more detail and how that impacted you?
Yes, absolutely. She was both bipolar and schizophrenic. So she heard voices. She thought God was telling her to do things. She would very oftentimes, in order to help herself feel better, this is all reflection because looking back, you can see things better. uh, she would oftentimes put me down and tell me how horrible I was. I grew up hearing from her that I was fat, that I was ugly, that I had a big nose, and that I could not sing. Um, Music is my passion, has been my whole life. So that was tremendously hard for me. So I grew up believing those lies because I heard them so much, I began to believe them. So that really impacted me pretty much my whole life. I was very close to my parents. My dad was gone a whole lot when I was growing up. He traveled worldwide speaking and also for business because he had a ministry that he ran. So he would go around the world speaking. So I didn't see my dad a lot. We had a good relationship, but it was my mom that the older I got, the closer she and I became. She became my very best friend. I told her everything. If I had questions about the Bible, she would be the one I would go to. If I had something to pray about, I would go to her.
So God was a part of your family, which sounds amazing. But as I know, I've had a lot of people on my podcast and I've had a lot of friends that were preacher kids or whatever. And a lot of times the home life isn't as great as what it looks like whenever someone's out in the audience hearing them speak. So tell me a little bit, you know about dysfunction. So I know that your sister had some mental health issues and stuff, but was there anything else that was going on in your family that that you realize now that maybe you didn't realize whenever you were a child?
Probably the mere fact they tried to bury the fact that my sister had problems. They really, I think it was partially the era. Don't talk about it. It'll be fine. They really didn't want to. They would try to discipline her. They didn't understand what was happening, but it was that family secret. We don't talk about it. I was told, don't talk to my friends about what's going on at home. This is something we deal with within our family. So that had a huge impact on me because I felt like I couldn't share what was going on. And then, just the mere fact my dad being gone so much, I craved that attention from him. At least for me, when he was home, when I was little, I would go to him and beg him to do stuff with me. Um, but that really impacted me later on as, searching for love in all the wrong places kind of thing. Definitely impacted me because he was gone so much and I craved that so desperately.
What were you like in school? Were you an outward personality or were you more withdrawn? Tell me a little bit about high school.
Um, my personality changed once I hit high school. I was pretty much a people person. I loved people when I was little. I would go up to strangers and talk to them. In fact, when I was very little, my parents would find me hanging out the window yelling to people on the street, "Hey, do you know Jesus?" Because I loved Jesus when I was little. So there was a definite change in my personality as I entered high school. Uh, I became more withdrawn. I still had friends. Uh, the rebellious nature started coming out. I did not remember until I was in my 30s that I was sexually abused when I was 5. And so that played a huge part, I believe, in my personality and how I perceive things. And again, the looking for love in all the wrong places, that opened up something it never should have in a child. So that definitely impacted me in my teen years, between my dad being gone so much, the things I was dealing with my sister. Even though I didn't remember the sexual abuse, there was still all of these emotions that I was dealing with that I did not understand at the time. So I never really became addicted to anything, but I definitely experimented. I, was becoming, um, I'll try just about anything once. Wanted to be accepted. It more stemmed from codependency than anything else because I wanted people to accept me and like me. So if I would do these things, maybe they would like me. So, and that really continued all through high school. I would go through seasons where I want to get my life back together. I got to rededicate it to Christ. And, I would try, but on my own willpower. It wasn't a surrender thing. It was just me trying to make a change. And I would do it maybe for a month or two, and then I'd be right back in old behaviors.
Did you have any dating relationships in high school? Were you allowed to date? I mean, tell me a little bit about your relationships.
So my parents didn't want me to date until I was 17. That didn't stop me. The rebellious nature came out in me. I started dating my first boyfriend I was had at 13. Um, it was very serious. I maintained the physical distance until I was 16, and then I gave up my virginity at age 16.
So, what did you think about yourself? So, you mentioned a change, a shift in your personality in high school. What did you portray outwardly, and what did you think about yourself? So, you said you became more quiet and reserved, but it sounds like you still had friends, you had a dating relationship. So, were you confident inside or were you insecure?
I was incredibly insecure. The older I got, the more I hated myself. I thought I was ugly. Uh, I wasn't, you know, but there was those voices that I heard. I call them my old tapes. All those things I heard from my past, and they just played over and over in my mind, and I could not figure out how to get past that. So I believed all of those lies about myself, that I was worthless, that I was ugly, that no one could love me, that no one would want me. So it was, I think, a lot of my trouble in high school stemmed from my own lack of self-worth.
So, what would you say your biggest struggle was whenever you were a teenager?
My codependency was huge in my life. It basically took over. Got to a point by the time I was 18, I couldn't even speak for myself. I had no willpower whatsoever, and standing up for myself was practically non-existent.
So you made a lot of decisions based upon other people loving you instead of you loving others. You were worried
Yes,
about what other people thought, and you tried to please. Some people call it people pleasing, but pleasing whichever crowd you were with. Does that accurately describe your teenage years?
exactly. That's a perfect description of my teen years.
So what happened after high school? Did you attempt to go to college, or did you get into the workforce? What was going on then?
I started college to learn how to repair computers. I got through about 3 months of that and found myself pregnant. And I could not, even though there was other options of giving up for adoption or anything like that, I could not stand the thought of me being that person, of being an unwed mother. And the man who got me pregnant proposed, and we got married. However, I knew him 3 months on the day we got married. So, and he ended up, when I met him, he was clean and sober. It had been for about 2 years, but he had a history of drugs and alcohol
Did,
prior to us meeting.
did you know about that history, or was that a surprise?
No, he told me. He
Okay.
told me.
So you got into the marriage, you start bringing in some of your own baggage, and he's got some baggage you brought in. What was your relationship like after the honeymoon was over?
The honeymoon phase lasted almost 2 years. So it was actually pretty good at first. I mean, there was the issues, I was only 18 when we got married. Had my son when I was 19. So it was a lot of change in a short amount of time for me. And there was an adjustment period. But he was a good husband at first. He really was. He was a good dad. He loved his son, and he would take time and spend with him. But about 2 years into the marriage, he relapsed.
Mm.
And that began the whole process of, let's try to get back on track, relapse again. Let's get back on track, relapse again. And then me being codependent, I was an enabler. I didn't stand up for myself. I didn't insist on certain things that I should have insisted on.
So in those younger years in your 20s, whenever you had a child, you were just married, did you try to infuse God at all into the relationship, or was he a Christian? Did you guys go to church? I mean, was there any God in your family at all there whenever you were married to him?
Yeah, at first, when we first got married, we both went to church. Again, I still didn't understand the whole relationship aspect. That plays a huge role in my life, that relationship aspect with Christ. he did attend church with me. He did profess to be a Christian. And it wasn't until he relapsed that he stopped caring about any of that.
So was it alcohol or was it substance abuse of another? Was it a drug? I mean, both? What?
Both. It started with the alcohol, and then the drugs came shortly after that. And heroin was a big one for him. It was a daily thing where he would either go out and try to score something or sell whatever he could. I would find jewelry missing. It was a very difficult season of my life.
So he relapsed 2 years into your marriage. How long did you make it after that?
Almost 16 years after that.
16? Wow.
Yeah. Okay. I am called the queen of codependency. Let me tell you, I put up with way more than I ever should have for the sake of what I thought was the sake of my children, thinking, got to keep both mom and dad together for the sake of the kids. And it wasn't until later that I realized how much damage I caused, for my part. There was damage from his part, but taking responsibility for my actions.
Did
You
you
know,
have any other children besides the one that you got married for? Or how many children did you have in those 16 years?
in the 16 years after my son, when he was 2.5, I became pregnant, but I lost the baby. And then 8.5 years after my son was born, I was pregnant with my daughter. So yeah, they're almost 9 years apart.
Okay.
So
So 16 years. So your youngest, the one that you got pregnant before you got married, so he's a teenager. I mean, in the middle. He's seen everything. I mean, I'm sure that your husband couldn't hide the drug addiction and all of that kind of stuff. How was that? How was that with how did you explain this to your child, and how was things at home?
well, he became very abusive in every sense of the word. Spiritually abusive, physically abusive, emotionally, even sexually abusive. He actually raped me a few times. Um, there was no hiding it at the time. I thought I was, denial. I was really, really good at denial. That's something I have to stay on guard for on a daily basis for myself. It's like that's a daily prayer for me, is to make sure I stay out of denial, because even after getting in recovery, I was back in denial again. So, that's a daily something I need to look for. But that ran rampant in my life back then. So, I thought I was covering things up. I thought people didn't know. They did, maybe not to the extent. I was really good at wearing a mask wherever I went. Oh yeah, everything's great. Look at my two kids.
Did you guys
Yeah.
talk about it? Now, you kept things secret in your family about your sister when you got married and all these things were going on. Did you ever talk about it with your kids and say, hey, daddy's got a problem, or did you just totally deny that at all? I mean, what happened to your kids? Did they withdraw? Tell me a little bit about their dynamic.
Well, obviously they also were abused, primarily my son. There was, unfortunately, um, my daughter was like this princess to him, even though he still said and did things that were very inappropriate to kids. You know, he still put her on. She was she was the most important thing in his life. I was second, and then my son was last. So he got the brunt of everything, and he broke his nose. I
Did your son, did it push him into some abuse himself with substances or alcohol or any of that other stuff as he got it to be a teenager or not?
Until he was in his teens, he pretty much vowed he'd never touch the stuff because of what he saw his dad do. But then he used it as a crutch, and he became an alcoholic. My daughter inherited my codependency, unfortunately, but she's dealing with that. You know, my son, picked up the habits that he saw in his dad. And as much as he swore he would never do that, it's exactly what he ended up doing. Well, first, I have to back up a little bit because I became a Christian before I got into recovery.
Okay.
Uh, when I got pregnant with my daughter, I made the decision there's no way I can bring another life into this world in the condition I'm personally in. There's something missing. And by that point, I was so confused spiritually because he was very very small amount Native American, and he chose to believe the Native American way. So he brought that into the home. That greatly spiritually confused me. So I had all of these conflicting thoughts. Okay, I was raised in a Christian home. This is what I was taught to believe. Here's this, and all of these other religions around me. What really is the truth? I don't know what the truth is. So when I was pregnant with my daughter, it's like, I don't know what the truth is. I absolutely have to know what the truth is if I'm going to bring another child into this world. So I knew at least there was a God. At least that much I knew. So every day I would pray, God, I know you're real, but I don't know anything else about what the truth is. So please show me your truth. Well, he would show me every day something that was a truth about him, whether it was in nature, whether it was in a newspaper article. God used Billy Graham in his articles in the paper to reach me. There was just so many things he started showing me. And then by the time my daughter was born, I was basically realizing what the truth was. And one day it just hit me. I have fallen in love with God. I am back in love with Jesus, and there's no turning back. This is my life. And from that day forward, I have been head over heels in love with him.
So, what did your husband think about that? Because you said he was kind of caught up in the Native American thing. And so, did you come home and tell him, or did you hide it? Or, what was
No,
that like?
there is no hiding it, because I was bringing my kids to church at that point, and it's like, this is how it's going to be. This is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do. And he did a couple times try to tell me that I couldn't do that, and I said, this is where I actually was not codependent, and because my faith meant more to me than what he thought of me at that point. Because I told him, you can tell me what to do in other areas, but when it comes to God, he comes first, and you cannot tell me that I cannot go to church.
Wow. So, did your kids make decisions? Now, your son, I mean, he's at this point, he's kind of got his own worldview of going on. Did he also go to church with you? And was he
Yes.
going through rebellion, or what was going on
That
in his
was
life?
just before his rebellion. So he was like 10 when we started going back to church.
Okay.
And it was young enough where it really started to impact him. He did make a decision for Christ. My daughter also made a decision for Christ. So they made those decisions then. Neither one of them are living that way right now. I have faith they'll come back. But it was an incredible time seeing how they were pursuing Christ during that time. And it was a life-changing season for me. And that was what God used to plant the seed for recovery for later on.
So, tell me what led to the breakup between you and your husband.
Well, me finally understanding my codependency and setting boundaries, understanding the fact that I could set boundaries and follow through with the consequences. By this time he was also cheating on me, and well, that started way earlier, but I was becoming aware that there were other women. Uh, Prior to me really laying down everything was what got me into recovery. Was my daughter was, I want to say she was 5, and she was sitting on the floor in between my husband and I, and we were having a fight. My husband and I were fighting, and he was in a rage, yelling, cussing, screaming, throwing things, you know, typical behavior, and me not reciprocating, but yelling back because I didn't know what else to do. But then it hit me. I looked down at my daughter, and she was sitting there playing in the midst of all this chaos, with all of the things being thrown, all of the yelling. She was sitting there playing and humming. And I could almost physically see the wall that she had built up around herself to protect herself from all the chaos that she was living in. And at that moment, it's like, this isn't right. This cannot be normal. This is not healthy. I've got to do something. Something has to change. And so I looked up, I heard about Codependence Anonymous. So I looked them up thinking they could tell me how to fix my husband. Like that's really going to happen. But I looked it up and I started going there. That was June of 2002. And I went there for about a year. And my first meeting, I really expected them to give me ideas on how to fix everything. And I listened to them thinking, man, these people are really sick. And then by the end of the meeting, I was in shock because I came to the realization I was sicker. Queen of Codependency, finally coming to terms with the fact I am codependent and I need to work on me.
So tell me about that. Did they believed in higher power? Was it a Christ-based thing or just a higher power thing?
Just the higher power. They were very much like AA. They had the same 12 steps and everything like that. And a lot of the people in that group believed in Jesus. They were Christians, but it was a secular group. So, and I lasted there for about a year until I found out about Celebrate Recovery.
So you were there for a year and you're still married, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So did this recovery program that you're in, did it start impacting you with your relationship with your husband? Did you start trying to come out of the codependency thing or not?
It was a very slow process. My eyes were opened, but my behaviors really didn't change a whole lot because I did not really know what to do. And it wasn't until I found Celebrate Recovery that I started to really understand my behaviors, why I was acting the way I was acting, what I should be doing. I had tools. I was given tools at Celebrate Recovery, not just for recovery. I was given tools on my relationship with Christ as well. During that time, my relationship with Christ exploded even more than it had when I first came back to him. It was an amazing season of my life of really getting a deeper relationship with Christ, me growing as a believer, me being able to finally understand my codependency and what it was doing, not just to me, but to my family and to the people I cared about.
So I want you to tell me how you heard about Celebrate Recovery. So you were a part of Codependency Anonymous, and then somehow you heard about recovery. So tell me about that, and then tell me about your first step study and some of the aha moments that you had.
Sure. So the crazy thing is I heard about Celebrate Recovery through my husband. So he was in one of those seasons where he was trying to get clean and sober. So he found a group. It wasn't Celebrate Recovery, but they told him about Celebrate Recovery, and they sent him to Saddleback for one of the summits. And he came back all excited saying, hey, there's this new Celebrate Recovery just starting. We want to go help them launch this program. So I'm like, hey, anything that's going to help you and will help me, let's go for it. And let me tell you, that was an eye-opening experience. Going through a step study and doing an inventory and all of these things, exposing myself to really looking at myself on a deep level. And by that point, I'm like, I want to get everything written down about my past that I can, because I want to get this out in the open. I want to deal with it. I want to be as healthy as I possibly can be. I will honestly admit I have begged God multiple times to remove codependency from my life. After a couple years of me praying that, he finally told me, I will not remove this from you because you need to depend on me when you're dealing with your codependency. So I'm not going to remove it. You just need to keep coming to me. So that's been what I've been doing ever since. I go to Christ when I'm really struggling in my codependency.
Yeah, and codependency, just like lust, is really hard to measure. Sobriety, you can measure alcohol or substance abuse or drugs. You can say, well, I'm how many every year sober because I haven't taken a drink or I haven't done that. But it's really difficult to say, yeah, I'm so many years sober from, codependency, because
Mhm.
you can make that decision in your mind, and just like I can lust in my mind. And so, we say, it's funny in my group, we always say, if we counted internal sobriety, we'd be taking chips every 30 seconds instead of every 30 days, because,
Yeah,
it's different. So it's a little harder. Codependency is a really tough thing because, and the Bible teaches us to care about what other people, there's a fine line there. So that's a really that's a tough one.
it is very, very hard. I have struggled with that. Some days I'm reading the Bible and it talks about the different um, behaviors and the things that we're supposed to exude, and it's like I got to be really careful with that because that will turn into codependency really, really fast for me.
Yeah. So it sounds like to me like you and your husband were in Celebrate Recovery. So did your husband have did he have change in his life? Did he have some sobriety? What happened to him during this time?
He lasted about 6 months and then he relapsed and went even more so back into his addiction and the lifestyle that came with it. And my codependent nature struggled with that, because it was so much easier, as a codependent when life isn't so hard, to know how to deal with all of this stuff that he even brought a woman home one time. How do you deal with that as a codependent? That's not okay. So finally I realized, look, it's time to set the boundaries. I had a really strong sponsor. She was an amazing influence on my life. And I would call her and say, look, this is what's going on. I don't even know. She said, well, have you been setting boundaries? So we talked about that at length. And so finally I got to a point where I had to set boundaries. It's like, okay, from now on, there is to be no drugs, no alcohol in the home, and no women. If you relapse, you need to go to a program, a live-in program. If you cheat on me, it's done. And I set these boundaries in place, and which was all fine and great until the first time he broke that boundary. And I had to stick by my guns and follow through with the consequences. And he tried going back into recovery. He refused at one point. It's like, I can't do this. I cannot live this way. We tried counseling. Even our counselor was like, this is just not healthy. Something has to change. And it was after one session in particular where he got so mad at the counselor because he said, you're picking her side, you're taking her side, you're being, you're not seeing my side. And he's like, if you're going to be verbally abusive, I'm not going to allow that in my presence. So he got up and stormed out, after yelling and cussing. And I looked at the counselor, said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. He said, it's about time. And that's when I made my calls to my sponsor, to my accountability partners, to my parents. I said, this is what's going on. This is my plan. I need you to support me. And they were all like, it's about time. It's like, okay. So that was the end of that marriage. So we were done relatively quickly. But yeah, he was able to talk my son into living with him. I had my daughter, so it's kind of like they got split up, which really I think was detrimental to my son living with his dad. That had lasting impact on him.
That's so hard. Let me ask you this question before we move on. So did you, when you went through, I don't know, your first step study, maybe you went through multiple step studies, did you deal with the sexual abuse? I mean, how did that come out? Because you said you didn't remember it until later. And so if you feel comfortable, talk a little bit about that. When did the light come on? When did you start thinking, oh my gosh, this happened to me? Was that in the middle of your step study, or when did that happen?
I'd already gone through probably two step studies by this point, and it was after the divorce. I was already remarried actually by this point. I was sitting in church one Sunday, and God told me specifically, He said, I'm going to bring to your remembrance something that happened, and you have to be ready to immediately forgive. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't know if I want to know this. And probably 2 days later, I recalled what happened. And it was not shocking. It's like, man, this explains so much, because I'd already gotten so much help through recovery. Like I said, I'd already been through 2-step studies. My relationship with Christ was strong and solid. I was ready to deal with it. I immediately forgave. It was a teenage boy, and I was 5 when it happened. And having those memories come back, it was a little overwhelming, but I was able to immediately forgive him. And I talked to my sponsor, and of course to my parent and my mom, and I was able to work through it very quickly because I already had all those tools. I'd already dealt with so many of the behaviors that stemmed from that. It was just the next step of healing for me. So it really became a point where within a few months it was a memory, not one that was detrimental to me. It was just a memory. Something I did not mention earlier, I was raped when I was 18. I dealt with that in the same way. I was able to work through all of those emotions and the impact it had on my life. I was able to forgive him. And now, was it a horrible event? Absolutely, it was a horrible event. But it's a memory that doesn't have the power over me that it did when it first happened. A lot has to do with that because I chose to forgive. So there's not that poison in me that's
Yeah.
keeping me from healing.
Wow. So Linda, so it sounds to me like things broke off between you and your husband, and then your son went with him, and you've got your daughter. So how long did you go before you started dating, and did you date, or what happened? Did you get married again? Tell me a little bit about what happened after that.
I did not go as long as I should have in between, when I finally got out of that relationship. I met a man actually in my recovery group. He was on the praise and worship team that I was also on, and he had been a pastor in the past. He had a drug and alcohol issue that he had been clean and sober for, honestly, I can't remember at this point, but it had been years. And the friendship deepened, and we ended up starting to talk about marriage, and we got married not even a year after my divorce.
Wow.
Yeah. So at the time, I really thought it was the right choice. Looking back, it was more rebound, and he was my knight in shining armor. So I thought, he was going to be my protector and take good care of me and my kids. And it did not turn out that way. It appeared great at first for the first years. It looked really good. About a year after we got married, God called us back to California, and for multiple reasons. I think God primarily put me back there so I could be my parents' caregiver. They needed me. We found a church, got involved, and launched to Celebrate Recovery. Um, let's see, we started it probably about 4 months after we moved out there, and it grew to be. We had pretty good group of about 75. It was Lives were changing. I think the biggest change was me, still learning how to overcome my codependency and becoming the woman that God wants me to be. And there was a lot of good stuff that happened during that time.
What started going wrong?
I noticed some behavior changes in my husband at the time. Um, I'd say about 6 months after that, um, we got a call to come into the police department. And I'm like, Okay, which wasn't unusual. Okay, we were both volunteer police at this point. He was a chaplain for the police department. He was one of the pastors at our church, volunteer. So it wasn't uncommon. It's like, okay, we need you to come down and talk, and we need to talk to you, is what they said. And so it's like, okay, we went down and we sat in a room what seemed like forever. And I noticed he started acting really odd and physically and visibly shaking. I'm like, what is going on? So at that point, they separated us. And I finally found out what was going on. He had been sexually abusing one of my family members for a long time, and he was being arrested. And this turned my world upside down. I
Mm.
mean, it was everything as I knew it was gone. My life was forever changed after that. Um, but the fallout from that was horrible. It caused a rift in the church. People chose to believe him over the victim, and there was well, how can she not have known this was going on? So people are accusing me of being aware, even though I wasn't. It was a very, very dark time. So I had to work through the issue of denial that I had been in, and shed that and realize, look, I'm always going to be subject to falling into denial. And that, like I said earlier, I have to be on a daily basis. Lord, show me any areas that I may be in denial in. Show me what I need to be doing today. What am I supposed to be doing with my life today?
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow, that's a huge amount of information that you just shared. A lot of that things there. So did your husband go to jail, to prison? And I mean, how did you deal? How did you go forward in ministry? I mean, did you have to divorce him? I mean, what all happened?
Okay, so I did have to take a sabbatical, obviously, because there was a lot of emotional trauma that I was going through. I waited through for the trial. He was sentenced to 25 years. He's still in prison now, because it was extensive. What he did was it was one person as far as I know, but it was very extensive. Um, I was able to speak to the judge at sentencing and publicly proclaim that I forgave him. Um, I still want him um, prosecuted to the full extent of the law because that's what he needs. However, I choose to forgive him. Um, just because I forgave someone doesn't mean I allow that person back in my life. There are times we have to, for our own health and well-being, to eliminate a person from our life. And that was one of those times. He needed to not be in my life any longer. So I did divorce him. I will not have contact with him. He is not a safe person for me to have contact with. However, because I have chosen to forgive him, there is not that poison in my head, that him having free space in my head, because I've forgiven him. That's done. I don't have to allow him in my head anymore. I don't have that poison in me because I choose to forgive him.
Wow.
And I will say it's not an overnight thing. I can make that choice to forgive, but the emotions of feeling that forgiveness takes time.
It's an ongoing choice that you
Yes,
make. But
exactly.
wow, and not just him. I mean, you've got several just in this short amount of time that we've talked. I mean, you talk about your first marriage
Yes,
and having to forgive that, having to forgive
yes,
the sexual abuse as a young child, and the teenager, and having to forgive him, and your other. I mean, you could teach a whole lesson today on forgiveness. And so
yes,
I love the saying that, and I always refer to it as bitterness, but same kind of thing where bitterness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
exactly.
Is because if I'm not forgiving, then I'm allowing that person to control a portion of me, or have power over me. But once I forgive, then I have let that go. And it sounds like you've had that, and that's victory. What a victory that is in your life. So it sounds to me like you're in a good place. Are you still as sober as you can be from codependency and that sort of thing? Is what's God teaching you today?
Yeah, so as far as codependency goes, yeah, there's always going to be a certain amount of struggle, but I have daily ongoing victories. I can stand up for myself. I can set those boundaries. I don't have a problem following up with the consequences of when they're broken. So for the most part, I have a great deal of victory in my codependency. Currently, I am in leadership at the local Celebrate Recovery program. I attend there, and I get to teach. I also get to travel to different recovery programs and give my testimony. I will lead worship where I can. I've been requested to lead worship at some recovery programs, and I'll do that, fill in when a worship leader is sick. There's so much that God has done in my life that can help other people. It's like if I heard my story back when I first started recovery, it's like, I want that. I want that. How do I get that? And now God gets to use me sharing my story and is saying, look, I can do this. You can do this. Anyone can do this with the help of God in recovery.
So, Linda, if you could have one message, and I know that's really hard because you've got a lot of messages in your story, but if you had 30 seconds in an elevator to tell someone what the theme of your life or the message that you would want to convey to the listeners, what would that be?
That there's always hope. Our past doesn't define us. Our relationship with Christ, and in Christ, there is hope. We can come from a hopeless situation, but God can change anything. My story shows that despite what I have been through, I can live in victory. If I can do it, anyone can do it. 100% change is possible.
Linda, thanks so much for sharing your life change story with us. Hey, if you are listening today and maybe you can relate to Linda's struggle with codependency, maybe you have allowed others to take advantage of you and you are sick and tired of being sick and tired. Maybe you are ready for a change in your life. Jesus Christ can help you change this unhealthy pattern as you surrender your life to Him, just like He did for Linda. However, if nothing changes, nothing changes. See you next time.
All right, so the scripture that's really impacted me in my life has really started back when I first rededicated my life to Christ. And it's Isaiah 61, 1-3. And it says this: "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor."